I'm going to tell you a story, and it's the story of somebody in this room. Now, if you know who this person is, and it may be pretty easy for some of us to guess, I have to say, because this is kind of a unique story, but just keep it to yourselves till the end. And those who don't know who it is, great. You'll get to know someone in greater depth. I have to say that this person has supplied me with way too much material, and I'm going to have to just see how much I can get through. Someone whistling for me? Oh, all right. Sometimes I just have to check because I do tend to forget the occasional item. All right, let me find the story, get ready. First of all, there's a story about, in the Bible, in the New Testament, where Jesus has gone down to the River Jordan and he's got baptized. He turns up to John the Baptist. John, who was Jesus' cousin, about 6 months older than him, and there's another story that tells how that miraculous birth came to be. John saw Jesus coming in, and John's job was to prepare the way for the Lord. Prepare ye the way of the Lord, make his path straight. So John was prophesied in Isaiah throughout the Old Testament. He was prophesied as the one who was going to come and make the way for the coming king. So John, although he was Jesus' older cousin, when Jesus turned up to be baptized, Jesus said to John, I want to be baptized. John knew just who Jesus was, that he was perfect, sinless, Son of God. John knew. He had to know because that was his job, was to prepare the world for the Messiah. So John says to Jesus, no, Jesus, I should be baptized by you. And Jesus said, well, let's just do it this way for now, which I think is a fascinating little statement, because what it kind of sets up is the possibility that Jesus will be baptizing John sometime in the future. Maybe. Who knows? But anyway, Jesus said, let it be so for now. Now, John, by the way, just a little to follow on that story, John didn't make it to the time where the Holy Spirit was poured out upon the church. He was killed, murdered before Jesus was crucified. Anyway, the next part of the story, the day after, couple of days, actually it was at least a month afterwards, because Jesus, after being baptized, was driven straight away out into the wilderness and came back. And then as Jesus came back into the Jordan and was passing through, John saw him again, said to a couple of his disciples, see that guy over there? That is the Lamb of the world. He is the one I've been talking about. And two of John's disciples decided, okay, we better go and find out who this guy is. They followed Jesus. They came up to him and they said, Jesus, who are you? Where are you going? Where are you staying? And Jesus said, come, follow me. See, find out. And so they did. And as they started to follow Jesus, they started to get this understanding that Jesus was the coming Messiah. And so they started to get this excitement in their spirit. And so one of them ran off to find, Andrew ran off to find his brother, Nathaniel. Hang on, I should have read it out really. I might be getting brothers and names mixed up. But anyway, one of them goes off to find Nathaniel. And Nathaniel was out having a bit of a quiet time, prayer time maybe. We don't really know what he was doing. But when he came back, as he was coming back, Jesus looked at him as he came close and said, look, now here is a man in whom there is no guile or no wickedness or no bad attitude in this man. This is a good, basically he said as Nathaniel come forward, this is someone with a good attitude. And Nathaniel said to Jesus, how do you know what I'm like? See, sometimes we come to God and we start to question, does God really love me? Does God know me? Does he want me? Am I going to be of any use to him at all, or can he use someone as bad as me? These are some of the questions that some of us might ask. Others might think, I'm God's gift, use me, I'm wonderful, that sort of thing. But it's generally not the way it goes. Usually we kind of doubt and wonder and puzzle. What is it all about? What's life all about? How can I make sense of my story? What is the ending of my story going to be? And so Nathanael said to Jesus, Jesus, how do you know what I'm like? And Jesus said, before you came, I saw you sitting underneath the fig tree. And Nathanael goes, well, it doesn't say that he did that, but I just sense like in the story that his eyes went like, oh, okay. And he believed Jesus because Jesus had insight and gave some supernatural insight into the location and the knowledge of Nathanael's prior story. That's right. Yeah, I'm starting to remember whose brothers are who, but it doesn't matter. Okay. It's amazing to me that there is like 2 or 3 sets of brothers in Jesus' followers. I mean, he wasn't very, what do you call it? Fair, was he? He wasn't fair. He said, I'm going to have these 2 brothers and those 2 brothers and these 2, and then I'm going to choose all these other guys, and they all come from the same town. No women at all. I'm not going to go there. It wasn't about being fair, but what I like about that Nathanael story is that Jesus knows your story. Now, you're sitting here and you're thinking, does Jesus know my story? Does God know my story? He does know your story. He knows your story better than you know your story. And what's more, he knows the rest of your story. And as you go through life, you will discover more and more of how your story has already had his story in there without you even knowing. That's kind of the theme of today's story. This story started in the 1980s when my uncle came to Australia to drive trains. He then convinced my dad to come over too. Dad was an interior designer, but his qualifications were not recognised in Australia, so he became an orderly at the hospital. After he came over, he eventually brought my mum over as well, and in 1988 they were married. 2 years later, in 1990, I was born. My earliest memory is making mud cakes while it rained out in the front garden. Down by the fence, behind the car, I made meatballs out of dirt, but they tasted gritty. I think my second memory was in pre-primary. At recess time, we were playing on the playground, and I told my 5-year-old friends that I had to go away to Perth. As it wasn't school holidays, all of my friends were confused, and I recall explaining to them that my brother had to have an operation. I've always loved fixing things and finding out how and why. It was around this age that I found one of my dad's screwdrivers, and I decided to find out how the TV worked. I don't remember this, but my mum said that it never went together again. A few years later, I thought I had found a secret channel on TV. There were only 2 channels back then, ABC and GWN. It was just playing Robbie Williams' Let Me Entertain You as the promo song over and over and over for weeks. I later discovered that it was actually the pre-introduction of Win TV, but I thought I'd discovered a new channel. It's funny though, the things you do remember, and strange to think why one's brain remembers the things that it does. As I started school, we had a class bird. It was a galah. It was well loved by all the students. And I also remember being very fond of that particular teacher, but I can't remember her name and wonder whether it was because she let us have a bird. Not sure, but it probably contributed. In year 3 comes one of my strongest memories. At the end of the second term, on the last day of school before the holidays, we were told that our school was closing down. It had to amalgamate with another school in the area. They got us to take the tray out from under our desks, carry them onto a bus where we drove to the new school and inserted them into our new desks. As small a task as that was, it gave us ownership of the new, shiny new school, and that we were to occupy. And after the school holidays, one of the first things to happen was that we got to put our artwork into the time capsule, which was then buried in the school along with 2 other capsules from the amalgamating schools. It wasn't long after this that my dad started to get sick. It all started with his muscle slipping in his arm. He used to joke and say that he was Popeye because the muscle looked almost as unnatural as Popeye's muscle in the old cartoons. From here, he got asthma and was always very short of breath. When we went shopping, he would walk very slowly. Things just got worse and worse until he had diabetes, had an enlarged heart, and he was in and out of hospital. He was very sick, and 3 times he was pronounced clinically dead, but he came back to life somehow by some kind of miracle. This happened 2 or 3 times over the years. We would constantly be praying at night for him whenever he was in hospital, sitting around the dining table together. It seemed over this time that he knew he didn't have much time left, so he started preparing to pass on. We moved to a new house closer to the school. I remember him cashing out his super fund and starting to buy things for us around the house. He bought a new fridge, washing machine, a new car with the intention of it being Mum's car, even though she didn't yet have a license. It was a little black Suzuki, in much better condition than the old red Holden Camira, but I loved that Holden Camira. It used to have one of those 90s retro steering wheel toys, the ones that have a light-up screen and go in a loop. I remember sitting in the back seat and pretending to drive it while Dad was driving. I still like driving today. Living in Cook Point was amazing. Cook Point is a suburb out here in Port Hedland. We were near the beach, the school, the oval, across the road, and we could scooter all over the area. I became friends with a guy named Dylan. He was the second youngest of 4, and we ran amok around Cook Point. We would scooter everywhere, and our favourite thing was to raid the cyclone cleanups on the side of the road. We once found an old cart that someone had made, and we painted it up with a few $2 Kmart spray paint cans, and then tied it to my bike, and I towed my little brother and Dylan around for the whole school holidays. My calf muscles were on point. Pity that didn't last. When I was 10 or 11, we took a trip to India, and we visited my dad's old workplace, an interior design company that was owned by one of my dad's close friends, who we stayed with while I was there. I kept trying to get onto the computers in their office every chance I got because I wanted to keep feeding my Neopet. Smartphones and mobile internet didn't exist then. So if you don't know what a Neopet is, it's a virtual pet, digital electronic little virtual pet that you feed somehow and play games with. Totally the craze back then. Most of the trip we just hung out watching Foxtel, and then one day my brother smashed the corner of his head on a grand piano that was in the house. I felt so guilty because I'd called him over to it and said, "Come quickly." He got stitches. Dad also got sick while we were in India, and eventually we came back to Hedland. When we got back, Dad brought my brother and I an old classical guitar to share. Up until this point, I'd only played piano, starting with a small red toy piano and eventually moving on to a proper Casio keyboard. I also got my first CD around this time. It was a Take 40 CD, a compilation of the latest hits. Until then, I had only borrowed my parents' CDs or played tapes, which I would use to record songs from the radio, always trying to get the song without the DJ speaking over the top of it, but somehow they always would. I remember doing that. Dad got sicker and sicker until 2002. He was admitted to Charles Gardner Hospital in Perth. I remember him being completely out of his mind. Sometimes he didn't know who we were or who Mum was, but sometimes he was completely himself. Whether this was the medication or his mental state, I'm not sure. I was confused and heartbroken to see my hero like this. Then, one day came the time to say our final goodbyes. It was time for the life support to be turned off. We went to the hospital and I got to say my last goodbye to my dad. Most of this day he hadn't been himself, but thankfully This time he knew who we were. I remember him being angry because he didn't think it was time to go yet. Then it was over and we left the hospital. I was 12. I was in a state of unbelief, not understanding why this was happening. I was in denial that it could even be happening. We went back to my uncle's house, who we were staying with while we were in Perth. I ran to the couch, planted my face into it and cried. I cried for hours. I was in disbelief, wishing that I could wake up from this nightmare. How does one recover from this? I don't think you ever do. There's a large age gap between us and our cousins. In fact, our second cousins are a couple of years older than us. So at the time, I remember our older cousins taking us shopping. We went to Big W and they told us that we could have anything we wanted. I didn't really understand why they were doing this. My mind was so muddled up. I didn't make the link between Dad passing and my cousins taking us shopping. Nevertheless, they bought us the full Harry Potter book set. I got a Digivice, which is a step up from a Neopet, I gather. Something I'd always wanted, which was a bit like a virtual Digimon pet that you'd carry around on a device that clipped to your belt. Not long after we got back to Headland, I started guitar lessons, finally getting to put the guitar that Dad had bought us to good use. My guitar teacher was Mr. Stephen Hutchinson, and there were 3 of us in the class, Jordan, his brother Anthony, and myself. We performed at the Pilbara Music Festival and at various other small events around town. From then on, I was never without my guitar. Even while doing homework, I would be playing guitar. We were gifted a few old AT computers from one of my mum's friends that didn't work. Always interested in the how and why, I decided I'd try and combine these computers and make a one working computer with the bits. I was successful eventually, but not without a few casualties. One time when Mum was out, I got frustrated that the computer wouldn't turn on, so I found a little switch at the back and figured I'd better try flicking that one and see what that one does. It said 110V, 240V. So I flicked the switch to 110V, heard a bang, the computer smoked and then caught fire. Thankfully, I pulled the cable out before it could do any real damage. Put the fire out quickly, and then I decided to research what 110V meant. The 110V explosion switch. I then started year 8 at Headland Senior High School. I met a guy called Corey who found out I played guitar and got me to go along with him to Latin band rehearsal. With him, I started playing guitar. Then not long after that, I started learning the tenor saxophone. Before long, I was in the jazz band, concert band, Latin band, junior band, and various punk rock bands, Spiky Bracelets and all. I developed a special attachment to my music teacher at the time, Greg McMurdo. Being that my dad had passed away less than 12 months earlier, I was needing a adult male figure in my life, and Mr. McMurdo, or M&M as we called him, really played this role for me as a big brother that I never had. Every day after school, we would hang out there together, learning and playing with his equipment. We would buy something new every week or two, and then we'd spend the next few days there after school until dark. Mum had just got her driver's license, so she would drive in and pick me up at around 6 p.m. every day and then take me home when we were done. I think she knew how much I needed to spend time with him. I learned more and more by working on events with him around town. In year 12, Cyclone George and Jacob hit the town. The destruction was massive. Bruno's Pizza Bar in Port was completely decimated. There were many horror stories of people losing roofs. Year 12, that was what, 2007 was Cyclone George, wasn't it? The community came together and held a fundraiser concert, and for the first time I worked with and met a local sound guy by the name of Kevin Angel, who was the sound guy for C3. The theatre was donating the sound equipment and Kevin was overseeing the stage setup for the concert. So I worked alongside him on the event and I learned a lot along the way. It's amazing how God carefully and delicately positions everything to intertwine. It was also around this time that I met my soon-to-be best friend, David Sullivan. He had moved to Headland as the IT guy for the council and had an interest in sound and lighting, so I started working with him. I finished my last exam in year 12 and then walked from one end of the school to the theatre and started full-time work the very next day as head tech of the theatre. Not long after this, Dave invited me to move in with him, and we formed a band together and together started running free youth events all over Headland. About 18 months into living together, David started attending C3. Until this time, I didn't even know he went to church. As it turns out, he hadn't been since he left Perth. He was rediscovering his faith and joined the C3 band, occasionally playing drums or helping Kev with the sound. And then he started to ask me advice about equipment for C3, and I was surprised, even a little curious, that a church would have a similar level of tech to a theatre. Though I worked on the C3, through work, I worked on the C3's MyGen Youth Conference that ran down at the theatre, Headland Carols, and also mixed sound for the C3 band at various local events. Welcome to Headland Night, things like that. I knew a few of the band members like Chloe, Josh and Luke, that's Lil and my children. Chloe was born in the same year as this person. This was really when I noticed God chasing me, as everywhere I looked, there was someone from C3. Sully began to nag me about coming to church with him, but I was reluctant, as my experience of church was as a kid in a Catholic church. While I knew it was important, it was really boring. Eventually, he asked me to play bass one week on the C3 band because their bass player was away. I agreed, and I went along to rehearsal, and I soon discovered that they had no bass player. It was then that I properly met the talented Sally Zelke, who was leading the band and would later be an essential mentor to me and my walk with Christ. I started to attend C3, sometimes on stage, sometimes in the congregation. And as this happened, I started having relationship struggles with my then girlfriend of 5 years. She was freaked out by the whole church thing. One day she gave me the ultimatum. She said, "It's either me or church." And I chose the church. At this time, it was utterly devastating for me. I was blinded by the fact that the relationship was filled with manipulation on both parts. We were both unhealthy humans. Although it didn't appear so at the time, the end of the relationship was the biggest blessing, as it was the following year that I reconnected with an old school friend who later ended up becoming my wife and is in this room today. God then started to show how he could increase my life. I got promoted at work. Within 3 years, I became venue supervisor. My business got busier and busier, and for the second time, my band made it to the top 16 bands for the Australasian finals of the Global Battle of the Band competition. I kept playing in the C3 band, and eventually, through Sally's coaching and discipling, started leading the worship until she eventually trained me to lead the team, and in 2015, I have the honour of taking over C3 music director role. Please welcome to the stage, Brad Holder.
Hello.
How are you? Hello, how are you?
I'm good, how are you?
What's your wife's name?
It's Jackie.
What's your kid's name?
Lily. Hi, Lily.
It's so good. This is a great story. I learned so much about you that I've never known before.
Really?
Yes.
Okay.
Even some of the things that I didn't read out, all those stories, and maybe we could talk about a couple of them. But I just wanted to talk about you from my point of view. I remember the first time I remember you was at the Courthouse Art Gallery, and I was walking outside, and you were playing a tune on your acoustic guitar. I think it was John Mayer. Maybe we've discussed this. I thought it was Jack Johnson, but you said no, you don't play Jack Johnson.
I don't think I've ever played a Jack Johnson song.
No, okay.
I'd like to, I should, but I haven't.
Yeah, no, well, I just remember you playing the song, and I knew the song, and I remember thinking, this kid is good. Because you were still in school at the time. My son Josh knew you. My daughter Chloe was born the same year as you,
Next year?
1990. You were born 1990. She was born.
91.
She was born the year after you. Hi, Chloe.
We're going to have to tell her to watch this.
Yes. Don't you love that? Okay. Back to the real stuff. Yeah, so, and Luke was in the same class as your younger brother, Howie.
Yes, that's right.
So I remember Luke coming home and talking about Howie, and somewhere along the line I made the connection, and I remember Luke asking Howard to one of his birthday parties, maybe 11, 10, and it was in this room when we were painting the ceiling and refurbing everything, and the place was bare. So that's my memories of early memories of you. David Sullivan, however, came to me and said, "Can I ask a non-Christian to play bass?" And I said, "Yes, sure." We had a young fella. I said, "Yeah, sure." We had a young fella on stage for 3 years before he got saved. I said, now he's in the worship team down in Perth. So that was a yes, and that's how come that happened.
It's good to hear the other side of it.
It's a funny story, isn't it? I later discover they had no bass player. Great. That was clever, David. Hi, David.
Well played.
Now, that'll do. I even remember where you used to sit when you were sitting down. And that's awesome, Brad. So tell me, what are the themes that you see coming through your life? One of the things that we have talked about together was that whole knitting together of your story even before. Come and stand up a little bit closer. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, that's better. Before you made that decision to walk with God.
Yeah, I just really felt like everything I was doing in my life was all leading towards this. But I didn't know it at the time, which was really cool because it's only in that way that God can orchestrate something so carefully.
Yeah. It's amazing, isn't it? Because you look back and a lot of the things that I just love the story of catching up with Kev and then David getting back into church, and he was the one that it's really like God's really on your case.
Oh yeah, definitely. Like it was crazy. Like everywhere I looked, there was someone from C3 or something. It was amazing.
Yeah, and that just, when I read that, I thought, oh yeah, this is why we're involved in the community. This is why, we do what we do. It's so that you make these little opportunities for connections to happen.
That's right. Absolutely.
Yeah, cool. So, tell me about you moved to the post-reveal your work. You moved straight into the Matt Dan. You started buying some equipment, and then you went to an event in Karratha, Birds of Tokyo.
Yeah, so I was lucky enough to go down and work on a Birds of Tokyo gig in Karratha when they were a really small band. I think there was like one hit that they had out at that time, which was pretty cool. And I met the sound guy there and connected up with him, and he really kickstarted my career in sound for the next sort of 10 years. So that was an amazing experience.
Yeah, and I know Birds of Tokyo because when I was on council, you said to me, "Hey, make sure you come to the Northwest Fest." I said, "Yeah, I am," because Birds of Tokyo are going to be there. So they obviously, now later down the track, you worked for the council, town of Port Hedland, and were instrumental in helping with that. Tell us a little bit about your work in the public arena.
In the public arena? I guess I was lucky enough to work on lots of festivals and events and things for the council. So everything from booking theatre shows through to music festivals and bits and pieces. So, yeah.
That's good. I'm just going back to find something here that I thought I'd like to read out. This is... can I tell that story about your event in Perth?
Yeah, go for it.
Or what about you tell it?
No, that's all right. I want to hear it from you.
Okay. This is in high school. It was around this time that I got my first taste on the big stage. A trio that I was a part of had competed in the local Star Search heats for a strange acoustic rendition of Amazing Grace. We had made it into the finals and got the chance to perform at the Burswood Dome. There was a section in the song where I was to slide out on my knees to the front of the stage, wearing knee pads under my jeans, do a guitar solo. But what I didn't realise was that the front of the stage of this venue was carpeted. And so when I slid out, I ended up on my back. Anyone in their right mind would stop there. I didn't. I decided to do an almost upside-down worm with my guitar to try and recover. It was a hilarious disaster, and what made it worse, the girl that I liked had just moved down to Perth and witnessed the whole thing. Good.
Yeah, it sure was.
Sorry, it was really not really relevant, but I thought it was funny. So, yeah. No, but all our stories, you know, there's so many portions to our stories. Okay, I've now gone and lost the last page, but oh no, there it is. So, venue public speaking. Tell us, I actually found it quite interesting that just over this last year, Lil and I, you know, we've been going through a whole thing with her dad, and when it came down to it, the time that my grandma and Lil's dad died was precisely the moment that we were supposed to be going to conference, now national conference, which I love, and the first time that we were going to take you and Jackie there, and for the first time in 17 years, we didn't get to go, but you guys did, on your own. And I just remember being really bummed about this a couple of weeks back and thinking, this really sucks. And then I thought, hang on a moment, maybe this is God. Maybe this is God's timing. What do you think about that?
Yeah, look, I would say definitely in some ways. It was obviously terrible that we didn't get to hang out with you guys there, but
Yeah.
the fact was we got to network with lots of people, and it forced us to move out of our comfort zone and actually meet lots and lots of people from all the C3s around Australia, which was amazing. I mean, we met lots of different people all the way from C3 Picton was one in particular, and those guys have just moved into doing kind of some of the tech stuff that we're doing, so we kind of connected a bit and exchanged some info, which was great. Yeah, it was phenomenal.
Great, C3 Picton, and just once again you start to see, what is it that you connected with C3 Picton about?
Mainly the automatic syncing of our lyrics and everything that we're doing here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, because all this stuff that goes on so that we can worship is largely put together, led by Brad, and he puts it together. And I'm like impressed with it. I've been to all the conferences over East, and I think that we've got a fantastic system here. As I hear tell when, you know, John Finkeldy comes up, he says, you know, you guys are doing stuff here, kicking goals way beyond so many bigger churches around the nation, as good as the biggest churches around the nation. And I'm like, that's Brad.
And the team.
And the team, of course.
Definitely not just me.
No, look, it is. And so when John was up here last and I was chatting with him, one of his suggestions was that you do start connecting with some of these other churches and help them. And maybe even put together a package where, you know, it could be that they, you know, there'd be some costs involved which they may have to cover and get you to go and help these. It's all about connecting. Fantastic. So that's what Picton was talking with you about, and
Yep.
fantastic.
Absolutely.
Love it. Is there anything you'd like to say finishing off?
Not particularly.
Okay, you'll get another chance. I'll give you all this back, and you can bring some of the stuff that I didn't do in your next talk.
Sounds good.
I was hoping you'd say that. Thanks. Let's thank Brad. So that's it. God knew Nathaniel. Jesus knew Nathaniel even before he was in his sight. God knew Brad way before he was in our sight. God knows you and has known you for longer than you've known you. And he knows what comes next. I've loved this series, and the feedback that I get from people is just, we like the stories. We like hearing the interaction of God and our stories. They're just so real. I've enjoyed it on two levels. I've enjoyed the fact that you get to hear and get to know, and you walk away and you know, oh, I never met Dean before, but now I know him. Haven't met Danielle before, but now I know her. something of her. We as a congregation are so enriched as a group of people who all of a sudden we get to understand and empathize with these people, these faces that are around us that often we just don't know. That's one side of the thing. The other side of the thing, the other side of the telling your story is the actual transformation that happens in the person as they prepare to tell their story. Almost every person I've spoken with has said, this has really brought some things to the surface. When I wrote that, I cried. When I wrote that, I realized that God has had me in his care. Telling your story is amazing. And what happens is, we get right back to the very first verse that I read on the very first Sunday 5-6 weeks ago, Acts 1:8, where Jesus said, wait in Jerusalem because the Holy Spirit is going to come upon you to be my witnesses. Or in other words, as I like to rephrase it, wait in Jerusalem because the Holy Spirit is going to come upon you in power to tell your story. Now, we're going to have one final song before we close in prayer. But what I want to do is I want you to just think a moment while we're singing this song. I love that, the words of the previous one that we just sung last, great is your faithfulness. God, such a faithful God. But what I want you to think about is, how would you go with telling your story? Would you like to do something like what you've seen some of these people doing? Because I would like to tell your story as well. Maybe I won't get to tell everybody's story. Maybe not everyone is open to having that done, but certainly think about your story because it is the power of God upon you. It is what will transform, whether you tell it from the stage or whether you tell it one-on-one to a friend, someone who's going through something similar. This is the power of God on you. Celebrate the power of the Holy Spirit on you. Next week, we move into a series that's called Empower as a lead up to our conference. There'll be 4 weeks of Empower. I'll be talking some more about, we'll be actually picking up right from this, Acts 1:8, picking up from there and talking about the Holy Spirit. So I'll hand back to the worship team.